Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Change Troubleshooter podcast. And today I'm delighted to have Patrick Hillberg with us. Hi, Patrick, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nina. This is cool. Thank you so much. I have a lot of fun with this, and it's a lot of fun talking to you. So this will be fun.
So, oh my God, what am I doing to Richard? Honestly, I have such a name issue on these podcasts. It's a regular thing, so I'm just going to keep this running now. Where I either can't pronounce people's names properly, or I just give you a new name. It seems. Patrick has so much experience in industry, leading teams in PLM, digital manufacturing, process planning, robotics, machine vision applications, aerospace, shipbuilding, automotive, construction, and packaging. And he also teaches at Oakland University. So there is no better person I know to talk about this topic that we're going to face today, which is changing mindsets on an industrial model. Ooh.
Very cool.
And you and I met through the Green PLM Global Alliance Network.
That's right.
So we have a love of sustainable working, thinking, and wishing that more sustainable ideas were filtering through these industrial models in common.
And that might be why you keep calling me Richard. You're probably thinking of Richard McQuall, who runs the PLM Green Global Alliance. So shout out to Richard on that one. So.
Thank you for trying to explain that, but it's just probably the afternoon and losing it as usual. So, you have such experience, Patrick. So tell us a bit about how you started off and how have you managed to work in all these different environments?
Sure. It's just kind of a little bit one thing after another. And I suppose I get bored kind of easily. So, and there's certainly been a couple times in my career I have made major shifts really because I was bored. Let's see. My undergrad is in computer science. I became interested in robots in the 1980s. So my first career was writing software for robots.
Really?
Yeah. Robots and machine vision systems. So I was doing I was doing laser guided robots, which sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
And I want to start moving my hands like this as well.
Yeah. These were the traditional factory robots, and a laser was just a nice way to shine a focused beam of light on it. So so I was doing machine vision and robots, and then I reached a point in early 2001 where once again I was bored, and Oakland University, and let me say that Oakland is in Oakland County, Michigan, which is not at all related to Oakland, California. So in a worldwide audience, sometimes that's a little confusing. Oakland County is just north of Detroit. We're very heavily into the automotive realm. We'll talk about my class in a little bit, but generally most of my students are in the auto industry, and in the school really serves the auto industry. So in any event, that's Oakland University. And in the early 2000s, I was looking to make a change, and Oakland University gave me a fellowship to work on my PhD. So for 3 years, I was a full-time student, which was really a terrific thing. It was a great event in my life. So from there, I moved into PLM, first with Dassault and in their Delmia brand, and then then over to Siemens, and wasn't a particular brand. It was just kind of all of Siemens, or all of Siemens PLM anyway. So, so I'm losing my train of thought, but
so what time of year was this, your PLM transition?
What time of year?
Well, what year? What
year? Oh, I'm sorry. The PLM transition was in 2004. So I finished my dissertation in 2004, and then I went to Dassault shortly after that. My dissertation looked at the idea of if you've got a factory and the factory has machines and the machines have, each machine has a different sort of reliability, you could actually pull that data out of the machines and then run a simulation on that data. So you could simulate in the simulation based on real live data that was coming out of the plant. So and one of the things I noticed was that, if you've got 3 engineers working on a problem, they're going to come up with 5 ideas on how to solve it. And one of the things I talked about in my dissertation is you could use the simulation to figure out how to get better throughput out of the real plant. So Mike Greaves is a pretty famous person in the whole digital twin and PLM space, particularly in that time frame. And he was a couple years ahead of me in his thinking of a digital twin, but I'm going to take a little bit of credit for this. That my 2004 dissertation discussed the concept of a digital reliability twin. However, it took 15 years before anybody understood what I was talking about. So, I mean, just to have the conversation with people, maybe not quite that long, but just to have the conversation with people, understanding why that was useful. And I mean, Mike absolutely deserves credit, not only for being first, but for really promoting the idea of a twin for that solid decade where I couldn't get anybody to understand what I was saying. So he was really pushing the message. So, so I was at Dassault, and then actually I went back to Siemens. I'm sorry, I went back to Oakland for a year in 2010, and then I went to Siemens. And in my time at Siemens, I was a lead architect. So I led teams as they implemented the Siemens software packages, particularly the Team Center package, which is kind of the PLM package at different facilities. And I eventually came to the realization that it was, the struggles with implementation were no longer technology issues. That the technology, not only could the technology do what was needed, it could do more than what people understood. So it really became a learning goal. So it was not about improving the technology, it was about helping the organization learn. And that really tied pretty nicely into my class. So, simultaneously, I was working with customers, helping them understand what product lifecycle management is. And I was working with students to help them understand what product lifecycle management is. And I got to be honest with you, that for years there, I would just take the same slides and use them in both, the exact same slide deck would be given to my students, and I'd put a Siemens logo on it, and then I'd give it to customers. And so that's my background. So
no, and it's a great timeline to follow, because companies still trying to get their heads around a digital twin. So, even when you say, it took 15 years for people to have that conversation is still very relevant now.
And it's becoming more relevant now. What's really interesting to me so when I was teaching digital twin back in 2013 and 2014, and once again, this is out of Mike's book, but really it was just an ink on paper chapter, and then me standing up in front of a class and trying to describe what was going on in the chapter. But in the last few years, lots of companies have really taken it on, and they've got marketing budgets, and now I can find lots of cool videos. So where it had been something that was pretty limited to the PLM companies like Dassault and Siemens and some of the others, Microsoft now has absolutely taken it on. Goldman Sachs has taken it on. Deloitte has taken it on. And then you look at Facebook, digital twins and the metaverse start to overlap.
Yeah.
And Mark Zuckerberg just completely renamed the company around the idea of the metaverse. So yeah, it took. I said 15 off the top of my head, but it's probably more like 12 in any event. It took a dozen years before I could find an audience that could understand what I was saying. But in the last 5 years, it has just massively taken off, and everybody is adopting it.
And this is so common, actually, isn't it? In that we don't really talk about much the change lag that exists. That when we come up with something, especially like this, that is fairly revolutionary to changing a process and a way of working so much, that we imagine that that change happens automatically because, oh yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's going to be industry changing. It will allow you to do this, this, and this. But actually, then just the wheels start turning. And first, everyone has to be educated in this idea. And then the reality hits of what it's going to mean to an organization, what it will mean to a workforce, what it means to capital budgets. And then the whole very slow process starts, which is why years later we might get close to actually implementing some of these things. And then we've got to wait a few years until the benefits actually start to roll through.
Absolutely. And progress won't be made until the benefits are seen.
Yeah.
So there's a virtuous cycle in that to some extent, but again, that virtuous cycle it can be slow going. So we'll see what, again, Microsoft and Meta and Goldman Sachs and Deloitte, as well as the big PLM players like Siemens and Aris and Dassault and Autodesk, and PTC. I'm sorry, I don't mean to leave anybody out. So we'll see what these companies do, but there's clearly a lot of emphasis behind it now. And I think, and there's enough money behind it that I think these are people who have the money who don't need to see the beneficial loop happening immediately. I'm sorry, I'm wandering. So
No, I mean, look at, the metaverse now that Zuckerberg's taken that over. He doesn't need to see a return in the way that most organizations that many of the listeners might work for and with have to see. They're on a completely different timeline. It's like the SpaceX projects. They form a completely different point of history, really, and which is a good point, a good anchor for us to move into the first question that I've got for you.
Sure.
Because these things are points in history, and sometimes it's important for us to look back and realize where we've come from, and then how this is actually how it does make sense, how it's not accidental what we're doing in these things, that we can retrospectively see the logic in what's happened behind us. And sometimes that can then help us accelerate the change that's in front of us. So
absolutely right. We were talking about that a little bit before you started recording, and I'm suddenly starting to pay much more attention to history, just to kind of help put some context around what's currently going on. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So my first question for you is, what are the industrial revolutions that we have been going through? What differentiates them? Let's start there.
Sure. Okay. So the original industrial revolution occurred in the late 1800s, and and there's lots of places where you can find references on the industrial revolution. So it really started with either the mechanical loom, and the looms were run by river power, or the steam engine, which was run by coal power. So the first revolution really is this transition from needing to use muscle power, whether it's humans or animals, to using either hydropower, or in the case of the steam engine, fossil fuels. And I just brought up a word there. We're going to come back to that. So the second revolution was about 150 years later, and that was mass production, and largely Henry Ford. And I mentioned that I live and teach in Detroit, so that Highland Park plant that he first started the assembly line is just a few miles from me. So in the second revolution, now we're starting to be able to scale. And there was an automotive industry before Henry Ford, and it made about 2,000 vehicles a year. But when Henry Ford figured out mass production and interchangeable parts, suddenly that's up to 2 million vehicles a year. And something I think that's equally important to that is Alfred Sloan at General Motors started managing that company based on a set of financial metrics. So while Ford was so dominant in the early automotive industry, by the 1930s, really it was General Motors. So they had taken Ford's assembly line, but then putting it into a series of financial metrics, pretty simple financial metrics, and measuring everything against those metrics. And that's called the single bottom line. And we're going to come back around to that one later. See, I'm laying these things in here so that I can come back to them. So,
you're a perfect guest.
So I'm a professor. I like to talk. So the third revolution, actually, this one's a little bit vague to me, but it certainly includes putting electronics into the factory. So when you start seeing robots in the factory and vision systems, and that's where my background was in the 1980s. So really, I started my career right at the beginning of what's the third revolution. There's something that's not included in that, but it's pretty important, I think, which is lean. So the Toyota production system also, Toyota production system started in the 1950s in Japan, but it starts coming to the US and into Europe in the 1980s. So the robot, they paralleled each other. They didn't overlap all that much, but they did parallel each other, and they're both important. So in the third revolution, I'll say, okay, vision systems and robots and factory automation and PLCs and lean are all in that third revolution. And then the fourth revolution is the point that we're at now. And I'll different. The fourth revolution to me is, it's not a picture on the wall where everybody can look at the picture and see the same thing. It's more like a three-dimensional globe. And depending on where you are looking at the globe, you tend to see different things. It's all one globe, but you have different perspectives depending on your stance. But I use the World Economic Forum definition of the fourth revolution, which is the merging or the overlap of physical and digital and biological. Pretty obvious example of that is your smartwatch. It's a physical watch that with digital capabilities that can monitor your pulse and your heart rate, or your pulse and your breath rate, and how well you're sleeping, and all those sorts of things. I think there's some other things, particularly when you get to biological. I think you'll see or are seeing a lot of this in industrial technology that's being used in the factories. We're starting to see it being used in farms as well. So both in terms of drones, which can drop seeds in certain locations to plant a field, and the GPS operated tractors. And then you're starting to see, and I think this is really interesting, vertical farms that can operate in cities.
Amazing. Yeah,
it is. I'm really big on the idea of localizing production, and a key thing is going to be growing food close to the people who want to eat it. So
I know. And so you say, you put this across in such a wonderfully simple and linear way that it feels like we effortlessly moved from one situation to the next, which of course we didn't. Each one of these transitions were quite disruptive and involved the catalyst of regulation coming in for health issues and damage that we were doing and things that couldn't be maintained. And so I find it quite interesting now when we talk about, people are already talking about the fifth industrial revolution, which is bonkers, seen as we seem to be at a bit of a key decision moment. Now, I guess if we were the people who had to think about transitioning away from coal when coal dominated so much and the air was black and none of us could breathe. I'm sure when you were facing the regulation that came in on that, you thought that your world was going to end. And then from a business point of view, you thought, well, this is it. We can no longer make any money. We're no longer going to have any heating or energy. How are we going to do all of this? And it's quite amazing that we find ourselves yet again in this situation, facing equally disruptive times for more or less the same reasons.
Yeah, it's something the steam engine, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and the Declaration of Independence. And in the US, yesterday was our Independence Day, as we're recording this. All three of those things, steam engine, Wealth of Nations, which is capitalism, and the Declaration of Independence, all occurred in 1776. Yeah. And a point that I make in some of my talks is we have never had democratic capitalism without fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to do that, right? I mean, we're going to have to figure out how to do stuff without fossil fuels. So there's this major disruptive change that's on the horizon. And yes, I believe that technologies are out there. We're seeing a lot in wind, we're seeing a lot in solar, we're seeing, there's something like 85 nuclear power plants owned by the US Navy. I mean, because they run the submarines and they run the aircraft carriers and those sorts of things. So I think there's a viable path for safe nuclear energy. I'm sorry. Oh, so this is the transition to, we're going to need to transition out of fossil fuels, but that is very hard on the existing companies. So I teach automotive engineers in Detroit. I mean, I teach a graduate course in engineering management, and most of my students are automotive engineers here in Detroit. And we walked through this in the class of, well, actually, we walked through what are the jobs to be done. So, what jobs are done by your automobile, and what that really means is what gets done at the destination. I buy groceries, I go to school, I go to work, those sorts of things. And then I ask, well, and we just saw this 2 years ago during the COVID lockdown, how do you accomplish those jobs to be done if you don't have a car? And what you realize is, you and I are recording this on Zoom right now. So, so actually what was pretty funny was the students this year said, oh, no, you have to go to work in person. You have to go to school in person. I teach the class in person, but I put it on Zoom, and I tell the students, you don't have to show up. I understand there's other things going on. I want you on the Zoom call. You're welcome to show up in class. So at the same time that they're all saying, oh, this in-person learning is so useful, they were also not showing up to class in person and just taking it on Zoom. So
I know, and I think this was so apparent for everybody. There was a real outcry, and this is what tends to happen in a significant moment of change, doesn't it? There's a massive outcry to no, but we want to hold on to this because this is so important to us. It really is. And if we let it go now, it's gone forever. That's how people react to these situations. But then the alternative is really convenient. And actually, we know it's really convenient. And given the choice, are you going to make the journey or are you going to turn on your laptop? And we know that actually, people don't want to lose the human interaction, and they don't want to. I believe that. But on the other hand, the convenience of this other side is so compelling that we see a change anyway, because the convenience, we're inherently lazy as human beings. So if there's food right in front of us, we're going to take it rather than the food that is miles away that we might have to go and hunt for it. So, this and history has shown us this time and time again. And what I love about what you were saying in your classes was, what are the jobs to be done? Because then the second question is, you teach changing mindsets in these transitions in your classes, and you're doing it with a group of people who generationally have worked for an auto industry that now faces the biggest change, because that combustion engine has never changed. And now we're saying it should. And of course, there's a lot of people going as I've just been saying, going, no, 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 we want to hang on to that. We want the roar of that engine. We want to feel something happening, the mechanics of something. We just don't want to go to some sci-fi version of this, which is silent and gives us no pleasure. But if the choice becomes you go to that alternative or you don't have one, then what is it going to be?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, my university, I'm not involved in this. I'm just aware of it. One of the local auto industries realized that they needed to transform from an internal combustion engine company to an electric vehicle company. And the high and the low of it is there are not enough engineers in the world, but they had too many mechanical engineers doing internal combustion engines. So they came to Oakland University, and Oakland created a continuing education program for those engineers to help them transition through this disruption that they're facing from internal combustion to electric vehicles. And I think about this. I've been teaching my class. I just finished the 10th year that I've taught the class, and the class, I changed the class 20% probably every year. So it's now changed, what is it, twice, 5 times, something. So in any event, the students that I had the first couple years, most were mechanical engineers working on their engineering management degree, mechanical engineers in Detroit, a lot of them working on internal combustion engines. And I think about this fact that I didn't see the transition from ICE to battery electric 10 years ago. And it's not just me, it's, you know, when you look at the disruption that they're dealing with in their career, and then you say, you know what, I think that disruption is going to be happening to lots of different careers. So it really starts, quite frankly, it starts changing the whole concept of the university model of, we're going to give you 4 years of education starting, you know, from ages 18 to 23. And most of you are done at that point. And that's all you're ever going to need to know for the rest of your careers. And some of you will come back for graduate degrees. But what do we do for all the mechanical engineers who graduated with their ME degrees in 2013? And now those ME degrees are no longer nearly as valuable as they were. So I'm in that long little example there, there's these major transitions, and it's not just in internal combustion engines, it's also in the university system and probably the entire education system.
Yeah, because you touched on it before. We all, even really recently, I did a postgrad in strategic leadership, and I had to do an academic paper on my leadership assumptions. And I went right back and thought, the person who has influenced me most is Adam Smith. How crazy is that? And I created a timeline of my own career and the people who have really influenced it across time. Now, thankfully, you know, I also did a course with Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leaders, and that massively has influenced me. But you are so right, to keep up, and really this is part of what society really has to digest, that the changes we face are not just on a particular industry, they are for all of us in all parts of our life. Now, the element of continuous learning, lifelong learning, is now, why wouldn't it be the norm? Because technology is changing so quickly. So even if you did something 5 years ago, you can't, it's changed 5 years later. So what are you going to do? Just say, actually, I don't know this, and you're not going to do anything else? So, yes. And it feels to me like we're being very slow on the uptake of this kind of change.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately. Um, I read a book over the summer. It's the sustainability book that everybody's reading called Ministry for the Future. And there's, it's hard to, as a professor, it's hard to say, well, this is what I'm preparing. This is the future I'm preparing you for, because I'm simultaneously saying the future is not like anything we've seen in the past.
Mm.
It's not 100% true, but yeah, it's going to be a very different future than what we thought it was going to be. December 31st, 2019, the world changed. And that was the date that the World Health Organization said, oh, wow, we've got a pandemic in this COVID-19 virus, right? So I lost my train of thought.
See, I'm just going to pick up on there while you're thinking, because I don't think the world did change. I think I think this is, again, maybe part of the phenomena that we have to burst. We have to myth bust some of this, because really, other than a pandemic hitting us and us having to stay inside for a little bit, and people dying like they do all over the world for all different reasons, but it hit the Western world, so suddenly we were a bit more interested. Nothing really changed, because still, this was a massive opportunity to look at the sustainable challenges we have. People were saying, isn't it amazing that people aren't driving as much? Isn't it amazing there's not as many planes in the air? Fuel prices went negative because of what was happening. And at that point, we could have seen that as a catalyst to really change everything, but we didn't.
I think there's a desire. I mean, I think we're in the early stages of societal change, where first there was this change that was forced upon everybody. And then there's a desire to get back to quote unquote normal.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I teach a lot of systems thinking and systemic risk and that sort of stuff. And really, COVID-19 there were 5 pandemics just between 2010 and 2020. Ebola was one, Zika was one, that they weren't as impactful as SARS-CoV-2, but they're a recurring thing. And actually, as the permafrost warms, there are viruses that have been frozen for tens or hundreds of thousands of years that are just escaping into the atmosphere. So I get, I talked about this at an event a couple of weeks ago, and oh my God, the crowd was ready to shoot me, right? Because I took them right down into the mud with just this negative view and stuff. But we're gonna have more pandemics, and we're gonna have stronger hurricanes, and we're gonna have more fires, and we're gonna have more droughts and such like. So I think, so back to your point of, yes, we kind of lived through COVID and now we're trying to get back to normal. And then there's going to be something that hits in the next few years that says COVID 23, right?
Of course. We're not even rid of this one. I mean, it's there. We're now just choosing to live with it, whatever that means. And, hopefully, and again, this was another thing I remember when I got really excited at one point during, I think, the first lockdown, when we were making such parallels between the pandemic and our own health. And that if we were healthier, actually, that was the real vaccine. Being healthy, having a good immune system, the scientists would work away in the background, but actually the thing that you could save yourself with here was being as healthy as you could be. And so I started to talk on LinkedIn with people saying, this is brilliant, isn't it? Because finally, there is a catalyst here to say, right, all the health organization people, agendas should come together and say, right, we know we've got an obesity crisis in some countries. We know some people are starving. We know some people have way too much protein. We know some people have hardly any. And this is a time to look at this and say, right, for the health of the nation, the world globally going forward, this is what we should be doing as our health agenda. But of course, nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. And we just don't seem to us grasp, no matter how many industrial revolutions there have been, because in this time we did a local activist thing in the village where we lived, and we had a doctor who deals with lungs and breathing issues, those life type necessities.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Keep us alive. And there was a woman who had lived through the worst times when when you were just taking in coal soot into the air, and it was just killing people. And she told a really lovely story about how we had managed to change, even when everyone thought that would be the end of the world if we changed everything at that point, and how we did clean up the air, and how we did get to a point where it was safer to be out, it was safer to heat our own homes, and we could do it without the thought of dying. But then somewhere along the way, what happened, as the doctor chirped in with, we swapped. We went past the point where these things were amazing, and we developed and developed and developed. So now the air is full of nasty things that we can't see. So we think it's okay, we just can't see them. And he was pointing out, in the area where I live has one of the highest incidents of infant mortality due to pollution.
Wow.
And that is just unbelievable. Unbelievable that is the situation we still find ourselves in. But we think we're breathing cleaner because we can't see it. Whereas the advantage of back when it was coal, that you could actually see it in the air. And I think there's just something about these cues, our reluctance to accept the issues that are harming us today seem to be wrapped up in the fact that we can't see them.
Right. Absolutely. Actually, in the systems that I use, two systems thinking books, one from Donella Meadows and one from Peter Senge. And in Senge's book, which is called The Fifth Discipline, he talks about these different systems models. One's called limits. One is called limits to growth. There's another one which is shifting the burden. There's another one which is tragedy of the commons. And in all of these things, there's a delay in the loop. And quite frankly, as an engineer, it's pretty basic controls loop stuff. If you've got latency in your system, if you've got hysteresis in your drivetrain, it just takes a long time from the time you turn the steering wheel until the wheels actually move, and maybe you need to turn back in the meantime or something, right? So in any event, the delay and delay becomes kind of an awareness. You're exactly right. If there's, well, take CO2 in the atmosphere, it's odorless, it's clear. We don't even know. I mean, honestly, I drink CO2 in my water, right? So the little fizzy stuff, but it's building up and it's building up and it's building up, and we're now just starting to see the effects. And unfortunately, by the time you start seeing the effects, particularly with carbon, it's too late to fix. It's the carbon's in the atmosphere. The carbon that's there now is going to be there for another 10,000 years. So I remember my point now on Ministry of the Future. So it's hard to say, I mean, we're not in a position where you can say, if you do this, then that will happen. So we're kind of predicting stuff. But in that book, he imagines some things, one of which is a heat wave in India that kills 20 million people in the space of a couple of days. And then a similar heat wave hits in the US Southeast. And then an atmospheric river hits in the Los Angeles basin, and it pumps so much rain up against the San Gabriel Mountains and then flows it back out into the Pacific, and all the buildings go with it as it goes out into the Pacific. So basically by the end of that chapter, the LA basin, there's nothing more than about 8 or 10 inches high, because it's all just flowed right back out. And then you get to the point, and I think this is where I think I see change coming. There's a point where some economists are talking, and the economists are saying, well, you can imagine a situation where the destruction is very bad, and it's so bad that the insurance companies can't cover it. And in particular, the insurance companies are covered by the secondary insurance market. So it's too much for the secondary insurance market to bear. And therefore, the secondary insurance market goes to governments as the payer of last resort. But the governments are already in debt. And what you have then is worldwide massive debt. And then they get to the point of, and then money has no value. So it's the complete collapse of worldwide currency. And to be honest with you, the little bit of hope that I have is you see this out of BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and these big asset managers. There's $121 trillion, which has signed up with the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. And the cities that the big banking cities are all within a few meters of water level, because the banks grew up around the ports, and the ports are close to the ocean. So personally, I'm imagining the situation where the asset managers say, we need to take responsibility for reducing the amount of carbon emissions, because otherwise we're no longer going to have assets to manage. So the best business decision for $121 trillion in assets is to start shutting down greenhouse gas emissions, which at the moment is, heavily into, there's coal and there's petroleum, and there's farming or meat. But at some point, as I just kind of rattle off here, is you can imagine the asset managers saying, we will no longer insure petrol stations. I mean, if you're selling gasoline, you cannot get insurance from us. And how long can you continue to sell gasoline? I mean, I think quite frankly, they could simply stop insuring the fossil fuel distribution chain and shut down that industry.
And the thing that's stopping that happening at the moment, of course, is the fear that will be the collapse of our economy as we know it, because we don't, as we keep saying in this discussion we're having, we don't know anything else other than a capitalist structure built on fossil fuels. We know nothing else. We can't look back to history to a point where capitalism existed alongside something else.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So now we are having to sort of look at potentially a new industrial model that says capitalism is not attached to fossil fuels, or there is something other than capitalism.
Yeah. So Oxford University released an online free Econ 101 textbook, and I make my engineers read the first couple chapters. And they define capitalism as having 3 tenets: private property markets, and firms then would be corporations. Later in the chapter, and I make my students read this, they also talk about external costs. So those are the costs that other people who are not part of the market contract face those costs. And an example I use are the lawnmowers and the leaf blowers in my neighborhood, that my neighbor hires out somebody to blow off the leaves off her yard, and there's a financial contract between them, but I've got a negative external effect on me, is that I've got to listen to darn things, right? So and it's in greenhouse gases, climate change is a huge external cost. So there's capitalism incentivizes individual progress. And it's been huge for the last 250 years, but we've never paid that cost of externality. So the way I pose it is we've been we've been putting all these we've been putting all the external costs onto a planetary credit card and making nothing more than the minimum payments, and now that has come due. So I think it's if you're going to take just as a mental game, if you're going to try to take the mental costs if you're going to take the external costs, currently in the US, gasoline's running about $5 a gallon. Well, what if it was $100 a gallon? How would we change our lives in that case? And I think to some extent, we change our lives in pretty much the same way as COVID changed our lives 2 years ago. One is we stopped driving. And actually, neat thing about this is you don't have to wear a mask, you don't have to get vaccinated. We just stopped driving. Now, of course, I have family that I see every week, and I need to drive in order to get there. So okay, how do we still do that? In COVID, we did things on Zoom, so you could go back to that. It'd be nice to have trains and light rail, and in the US, light rail is just awful. But I so prefer the light rail that I see in Europe. So in any event, I guess that's my thing. Is it capitalism? Once again, capitalism. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776. So was the steam engine. So was the Declaration of Independence. Like, that definition of capitalism never dealt with external costs, and now we have to deal with external costs. And I'm not even going to try to predict what's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but I think I think the asset managers will be financially incentivized to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they're already doing some stuff, and I think you can imagine them doing a whole lot more.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in the UK, my dad told me yesterday that for the first time he paid £2 for 1 litre of fuel. It's the first time that he's ever done that. I think most people have ever done that. We see on the news in the UK people saying, okay, really, I can't do this. One of the guys that I know at my boxing gym, he said to me, I had a job that was driving around to different gyms, but I didn't get paid enough to cover the increase in the fuel costs. So I had to stop doing the driving around and pick one gym. And so decisions are being made, and it does make you think. And I in a way, I hope this moment isn't lost with people, that we're so angry at the headline, the cost of living crisis, instead of the opportunity, turning this into the opportunity of, this is just a snapshot of the future. So this is like another, if we needed it, warning system to say, this is what you have ahead of you. So in the decisions that you are choosing to make, choose them wisely, because right now we know, and I go back to what I think is a lovely thing that you do, changing the mindsets of your students when you're getting them to say, what are the jobs that need to be done and how can you do them? And there's we have not, I don't think in my lifetime anyway, we have never been given so many opportunities to say, actually, I might try this a bit differently. And it doesn't have to have some emergency tag attached to it. Doesn't because it's the cost of living crisis or because I just can't get this at the moment. Our mind should be more progressive than that in thinking this is another transition. All these little things that we're seeing become a transition point that are taking us towards a different point in time again. It's going to mark a point in history, just like all these other revolutions that say at that point we saw a significant change. And I think at the moment, politically, there is a divisive timetable there, isn't there, that politics are sort of getting in the way of us simplifying the conversation in that way. And people who make a lot of money in the situation that exists today, and of course will want to hold on to that. But I think for most people, if we could get them in your class and that you could be sitting them all down and saying, what are the jobs that need to be done and what options do we have to do them, we would start thinking differently. We would start seeing a change of mindset on this stuff.
I hope so. I hope so. It's funny, actually, in 2021, the class, which was normally an in-person class, was entirely online. And I had students in 5 countries, 4 states, and 3 continents over the course of that class. So suddenly it's like, okay, you know what? So the idea of getting people from around the world into mine or anybody else's class is completely possible. And to the point of my students this year who said they were too lazy to drive into class, and they were bringing up the cost. These were people in the auto industry who were complaining that gasoline was too expensive to drive to my class, right? So the jobs to be done thing, it's what jobs do we need to do in order to have a society that functions the way that we want it? And I'm sorry, I'm wandering, but jobs to be done is part of disruption theory. So I teach a little bit of disruptive innovation, and disruption occurs when somebody comes in at the bottom of the market and can perform those jobs to be done, usually for people that you don't even envision as being inside your market. So, and there's examples in the steel industry, and there's examples in other places that I can go through. So I wonder a couple things. I mean, basically, we're dealing with this systemic issue that there are costs we've never paid for the fossil fuels that we're emitting, and the symptoms of not paying those things are the things that we're starting to see now. First, there's disease, and then the disease creates a supply chain shock, and the supply chain shock leads to first negative price of oil, and now astronomical price, and much higher than we're used to paying, although it's not covering the external cost of consuming that oil. Then of course we're bordering on a world war, so which is driving a lot of those sorts of issues. So and then we've got issues in the supply chain for battery electrics too. So in any event, we have, if we think of the jobs to be done in order to function well as society, there might be other ways of doing those jobs. And we learned that there were other ways of doing those jobs during COVID. And I think we'll go back there. I don't think people will want to go back there until they realize it's better than the other option. And I think what that means, I guess what I'm trying to get to is I think we're just going to have more calamities. And at some point, by the 3rd, 4th, or 5th calamity, if COVID was the first, people say, okay, we really do need to do something different now. I hope that comes soon, because the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere is going to last for hundreds of generations. But
yeah,
okay, I'm sorry, I wandered off on that.
No, it's absolutely relevant. And I think, as we said outside of this, that this is only the first recording of this topic. There was no way we could do 15 minutes on changing mindsets on industrial models. I mean, we've just really, I hope for everybody listening, what we've done is just start opening all the cans, and the worms are all starting to wriggle out. And I'm sure for those of you listening, there's bits that you would want to engage in as well, where you'd be saying, yeah, but you didn't mention this, and you didn't mention this. And we haven't even, and I purposely didn't take us down the electric car route, because that is a whole other podcast episode. But I think this has been a great starter of this conversation, Patrick. So
cool.
Thank you so much. for
Oh,
coming on
thank
and
you,
doing
Nina.
this.
Thank you for suggesting this. I love doing this sort of thing. So
And let's see if we can get some engagement and get some questions for the next one, so that we can see what other people were thinking about this. There's this idea of changing an industrial model and the alternatives that we have available to us. It's in its infancy. And I know the activists would like us to hurry up. And I think, you know, and those of us who are more experienced in dealing with change know that this will be a long transition, but it doesn't mean that nothing is happening.
and this might be a good thing to talk about. Maybe I would interview you on this. Think of the societal, think of the cultural, think of the organizational change for a company. Imagine an automobile company who thinks themselves as a transportation company moving into sustainable transportation using stationary power instead of mobile power. So we'll leave this for the next one, but how would you help that company work their way through that, to give up on the idea that we're an automotive company, but instead we're a transportation company?
Yeah, brilliant. Right, we're on. We'll do that. That's the next one. We'll
Cool.
change seats and you can ask me the questions.
I will do it.
Brilliant. It's been wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. This is lots of fun.